Welcome back. Now, we'd like to have some crosshairs in our screen, which means we need a HUD. HUD stands for Heads-Up Display, and a HUD is what we draw to the screen to show things like icons, text, health bars, and things like that. So we're going to create a HUD. This is a special type of blueprint known as a widget blueprint. And then we're going to learn how we can add it to the screen to draw the crosshairs. This way we'll have accurate aiming and we'll know exactly where our bullets will hit. So let's get started. So we need a widget blueprint, which means we're going to have a new folder in our blueprints folder. So we're going to right-click, create a new folder, and simply call this HUD. Now let's go into the HUD folder and right-click, and in the user interface section, we have the option to create a widget blueprint. So let's make one of those, and let's call this Character HUD. Now I'm going to open Character HUD, and this is the widget blueprint editor. We'll see that it looks very much like a regular blueprint editor with some key differences. For one, we have this canvas panel, and this represents our screen. We can place elements or individual widgets here inside the canvas panel. Now, our HUD widget blueprint has two tabs here. We have Designer, that's what we're in now, and we have a graph, and this is an event graph, much like the event graph in other blueprints. Here we can do calculations, set values of variables, and things like that. We even have an event tick, so our widget blueprint can tick and do something every frame. And we have an event construct, which is very much like begin play. And we have event pre-construct, which is called before event construct. So this is called even earlier than our event construct. So these nodes allow us to perform any sort of logic inside of our widget blueprint. But we're going to go back to the Designer tab, and we're going to add some crosshairs to this. Now, our crosshairs are going to be an image. Here in the palette, we see the different types of widgets, and there are quite a few different types. We're interested in an image. Now, we can click and drag an image onto our canvas panel, and we'll see here in the hierarchy that it's under the canvas panel as a sort of child. We can click on this and rename it since its name is image 0. We'd like a more descriptive name, so we're going to call this crosshairs. Now, the image is by default just a white rectangle. We want to set this to a crosshairs texture, and we have one in our project. Now here in the details panel with our crosshairs image selected, we can scroll down to appearance, and we have this brush category. And a brush is a type of widget element. It has an image and other properties such as image size and so on. Now we can select the image with the drop-down and type in crosshairs, and we see that we have a first-person crosshair. This is a texture. We can select that. And we see that we have this crosshairs texture. Now, it doesn't look right because it's stretched out. And if we wanted to, we could adjust its size manually. We can select these handles and try to get it just right. But what I'd like to do instead of adjusting it manually is to scroll up in the details panel and check this checkbox that says size to content. If I check that, now our crosshairs is the appropriate size. It's the size of the actual texture itself. Now we want this crosshairs in the exact center of the screen, and we also want it anchored to the center. What do I mean by anchor? Well, take a look at the top left. We see this symbol here. This icon represents how our texture is anchored, and by default, it's anchored to the top left of our canvas panel. This means if our game is being played on various different screens with different sizes and shapes, our texture will be drawn relative to that anchor. Now, I can resize the canvas panel, so if I wanted to show what it looks like on a screen of this size and shape, we'll see that that crosshairs is still relative to that anchor. I'm going to bring that back out to its default size. Now, I want this anchored relative to the center so that no matter how our viewport size changes, we always have our crosshairs in the middle. And we can do that by setting the anchor here in the details panel. I can select the drop-down, and we have various options. I'm interested in this one, which will anchor our texture to the center. Now, if I use the mouse wheel to scroll in, I see that our texture is not centered perfectly. And I do have to make sure that its size to content checkbox is checked. So I'm going to make sure that's checked, and I'd like this centered perfectly. Now we can do that by setting its alignment. If I set the alignment to 0.5, both for X and Y, then our texture will be aligned to the center. Now, it doesn't look like it's centered because our position X and Y are not 0. So we can set those both to 0 for X and Y, and we see now that our texture is perfectly centered and it has the correct size. So now that we have our crosshairs set up, it's time to get this widget onto the screen. Now, in order to get a widget onto the screen, we can use a node called Create Widget. That's the node we see to the left there. It says Construct None. If we right-click in a Blueprint event graph and type Create Widget, then the node will, by default, say Construct None. That's because we need to select the class for this widget. Now, simply creating the widget isn't enough. We have to add it to the viewport. That's what that second node is, Add to Viewport, and that node takes a target. We're going to use the return value from our Create Widget node. Now, Create Widget also takes an owning player, but this is optional. We don't need to pass in any values for that. So for your challenge, I'd like you to draw the crosshairs. Do this in the character blueprint on Begin Play. Create the HUD widget in the character's Begin Play using a Create Widget node, and also add it to the viewport. And don't forget to select the class in the Create Widget node. Once you've done this, you can play test the game and see if you need to adjust the character mesh. Maybe the gun is in the way of the crosshairs, so you might need to make some adjustments. So once you've done that, test the game and make sure everything works properly. Pause the video and give this a try. Okay, so we have our widget. It's time to add this to the viewport. So I'm going to go into FPS Character. Now, we need to use Begin Play for this. So I'm going to go up to Begin Play, drag off of this, and type Create Widget. And here we see this Construct None. But I can select the drop-down and choose our Character HUD. That's the widget blueprint we just created. And off of this, we can add to Viewport. And we need to make sure that the target is set with that return value. So let's compile and press play. Now there's our crosshairs right there in the center of the screen. And if I shoot, I should be able to see those impact particles exactly in that location. Now it's a little hard to see because the muzzle flash is a little bit intense. So why don't we fix that? I'm going to scroll out, and right here for our input action fire, we see our spawn muzzle flash function. I'm going to go into that, and here's our muzzle flash. I'm going to browse to this asset, open up P Bellica muzzle, and there's a glow that's a little bit too intense, I'm thinking. So I'm going to go ahead and disable that glow, and I believe it's the air glow here. So I'm going to uncheck that, and now we don't have that glaring air glow. So let's save that and see how this looks. That's a bit better. So now my crosshairs is showing me where I'm aiming. So if I shoot at one of these drones, then I successfully explode the drone. Now, when I aim, I notice that my gun is a little off from the crosshairs. So I'm going to need to make some adjustments. So let's do that. Now, to make this easy on myself, I'm going to go to FPS Character, select the mesh, and for animation mode, I'm going to use Animation Asset and select the aiming pose. So I'm going to type aim and select arms aim idle. Let's choose that animation. And now we're in the aiming pose here. Now, something you might not have known is that you can press play and we'll get our viewport here, which I'm going to resize down to a smaller window. And notice our crosshairs stays in the center thanks to anchoring. Now I'd like to adjust my mesh so that it's positioned correctly when we're aiming. So I'm going to take my Unreal Engine editor here and make it a bit smaller so I can see both the game being played and our character blueprint. Now I'm also going to switch from perspective to top so that I can look from the top. And with my mesh selected, I'm going to make some adjustments. Now notice it's moving as we're playing the game, which is great. Now snapping is enabled, and I don't want snapping. So I'm going to quickly disable snapping here and bring this back down. And now I can adjust smoothly. So I see that we have a couple of issues going on. First of all, if I move it to the correct location here, now my gun is sort of tilted a bit. So we'll need to fix that. But before we do that, I'm going to bring the gun down a bit as well. So I'm going to go from top to left. And with my mesh selected, I'm going to bring that mesh down just a bit. That looks pretty good. Now, my gun is angled a bit, and I can fix that by adjusting the socket. So let's go into our mesh. Let's select the mesh here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the simulation so it's not grayed out here in the details panel, and browse to the mesh and open that. And we saw that in the mesh, we can adjust the rotation of our socket, which we called hand socket. So we have our mesh editor open. I'm going to go back to my character blueprint and hit play so I can get that additional window there. And then I'm going to go back to my mesh arms in the mesh editor and de-maximize the Unreal Engine editor so I can come in here and make some adjustments. So I have my hand socket selected. I'm going to zoom in onto our socket and just rotate this a bit. Now I do have snapping enabled, so I do need to disable snapping. So I'm going to do that. And now I can rotate this gun. And I see that the gun is tilted up a bit too much. So I'm going to tilt it down slightly like that. So that looks good, but I see that I should adjust the mesh as well. So I'm going to go back to my character blueprint and I'm still in left orthographic mode. And with my mesh selected, I'm going to bring it down just a bit. And I'm going to go into top mode and bring it over just a bit. Now, you may have to iterate when making these adjustments. This is just part of game development. You're going to have to adjust things until they look just right. So rotating a bit, I can make my gun look just about right. There we go. Now, if I maximize my window, there we go. I think I've got it just about right. So now when I shoot, I know that I can actually hit what I'm aiming at thanks to my crosshairs. Let's see if I can get this one over there. Got it. Excellent. Now, when I stop playing, I get an error that says access none trying to read property animation blueprint. And that's because we're accessing our animation blueprint variable. And since we stopped using that, that variable is no longer set. We no longer are using an animation blueprint. And of course, we can fix that easily by selecting our mesh and going back to using our animation blueprint. So I'm going to select Use Animation Blueprint, and now we're using our FPS and MBP. I'm going to go back to perspective mode so we can see everything in our viewport, compile, save, and now we can just test play this one more time to make sure everything works and that we don't have any errors. So it looks great when we're not aiming, and when I aim, it also looks really good. So I got that drone, and let's see if I can get that one way in the distance. Got it. So in summary, we now have a HUD, and we can aim accurately because we have some crosshairs to sort of guide us a bit. And we also adjusted our mesh so that it's positioned perfectly when we're aiming. And now everything looks aligned and our game is getting more polished. Excellent job. I'll see you soon.